She still needs training, my boss Marcus said with that smug laugh, loud enough for the entire conference room to hear. 8 department heads turned to stare at me like I was some intern who'd just spilled coffee on the quarterly reports. But what Marcus didn't know, what he was about to discover in the most humiliating way possible, was that I had trained his own supervisor when he first joined this company. The Seattle rain hammered against the windows of Henderson & Associates that Tuesday morning, but nothing was louder than the silence after Marcus's comment. I sat there, fingers wrapped around my coffee cup, watching steam rise like my barely contained fury. 8 years with this company, 8 years of building client relationships, designing retention strategies, mentoring new hires, and this 35-year-old MBA graduate thought I needed training. Marcus Chen had been my boss for exactly 3 months. 3 months of subtle condescension, questioning my methods, treating me like I was fresh out of college instead of someone who'd been closing deals while he was still studying for his Wharton finals. Today's quarterly review was supposed to be routine. Instead, it felt like a public execution. Your client retention rates are adequate, Sarah, Marcus continued, his voice dripping with false concern. But your approaches feel very 2015. The industry has evolved. Adequate. The word hit me like a slap. My retention rates weren't just good. They were legendary. The Morrison account had specifically requested me for 3 consecutive projects. The Peterson Group had doubled their contract value under my management. But apparently, to Marcus, I was still the student, and he was the teacher. I think what would benefit you most, he said, leaning back in his chair like some corporate king holding court, is structured mentoring. Someone to guide you through more sophisticated strategies. The other consultants shifted uncomfortably. Jennifer shot me a sympathetic look. Everyone knew my track record. Everyone except the man who was supposed to be evaluating it. We'll discuss this over lunch, Marcus announced, as if he was doing me some grand favor. I have some ideas about bringing your skill set up to current standards. Current standards. From a man who'd been here 3 months. As the meeting ended and people filed out, I remained seated, staring at my reflection in the polished mahogany table. Marcus had no idea what he'd just set in motion. He had no idea that his little power play was about to backfire in spectacular fashion, because tomorrow's lunch wasn't just going to be a mentoring session. It was going to be the day Marcus Chen learned exactly who he was dealing with. The restaurant Marcus chose screamed corporate power play, white tablecloths, crystal glasses, and the kind of prices that made you think twice about ordering appetizers. He wanted me to feel small, out of place, grateful for his guidance. Instead, I felt like a hunter watching prey walk into a perfectly laid trap. I arrived first, choosing a window table where downtown Seattle sprawled below in its typical gray glory. Marcus appeared 15 minutes late. No apology. Just that same condescending smile as he surveyed the dining room like he owned it. Sarah, he said, settling into his chair with theatrical importance. I'm glad we could do this. This conversation is going to be very educational. Before I could speak, he was already ordering for both of us. We'll have 2 salmon specials and house salads, he told the server without asking my preference. And bring us your best Pinot Grigio. The arrogance was breathtaking, but I stayed quiet, curious to see how deep this hole he was digging would get. Now, Marcus began, unfolding his napkin like he was unveiling some masterpiece. Let's talk about your development plan. I've been studying your client files, and while your work is serviceable, there's tremendous room for growth. Serviceable. Another knife twist. The thing is, Sarah, he continued, taking a self-important sip of wine, consulting has become much more sophisticated since you started. The methodologies we're using now require a different level of strategic thinking. I nodded politely while internally cataloging every condescending word. Marcus was building his case for why I needed his wisdom, completely unaware that he was about to meet the very person who could destroy his entire narrative. What I'm proposing, he said, leaning forward like he was sharing state secrets, is intensive mentoring. Someone with real experience to guide you through advanced client management techniques. That's when I heard it. Familiar laughter from across the restaurant. My heart rate spiked as I recognized the voice immediately. Robert Kellerman, regional director, and Marcus's direct supervisor. The man I had personally trained for 6 months when he joined the company 2 years ago. Marcus heard it too, turning around with that eager puppy expression he wore around senior leadership. The same Robert Kellerman who still called me for advice on complex client situations. The same Robert who had implemented my retention framework company-wide. "Robert," Marcus called out, practically jumping from his seat. What a wonderful surprise. Robert Kellerman walked toward our table with his characteristic confidence, silver hair perfectly styled, wearing the relaxed authority that comes from actual competence rather than manufactured importance. This was it. The moment 3 months of condescension would come crashing down on Marcus's head, and he had no idea what was about to hit him. "Marcus, good to see you," Robert said warmly. Then his eyes found mine and lit up with genuine pleasure. "And Sarah! Perfect timing! I was just bragging about your Morrison account success to the executive committee this morning." I watched Marcus's face in real time as confusion began to creep in. The confident executive who'd been lecturing me about sophisticated strategies suddenly looked like someone trying to solve a puzzle with missing pieces. "You two know each other?" Marcus asked, his voice carrying the first note of uncertainty I'd heard from him in 3 months. Robert's smile broadened, and I could see the exact moment he sensed the tension crackling between Marcus and me. 20 years in corporate leadership had taught him to read rooms like crime scenes. "Know each other?" Robert chuckled, placing a friendly hand on my shoulder. "Marcus, Sarah here is one of our most valuable assets. She trained me during my entire onboarding process when I joined the company." The wine glass in Marcus's hand stopped halfway to his lips. The color drained from his face so quickly I thought he might need medical attention. Around us, the restaurant continued its expensive bustle, but our little corner had become ground zero for a professional earthquake. "Trained. You?" Marcus whispered, like he was questioning the laws of physics. 6 months of intensive mentoring, Robert continued enthusiastically, completely oblivious to the devastation he was causing. Client management systems, relationship-building strategies, advanced consultation techniques. Honestly, I probably wouldn't have survived my first year without Sarah's guidance. Marcus set his wine glass down with shaking hands. I could actually see his mental organizational chart collapsing in real time as he tried to reconcile the woman he'd been condescending to with the consultant who had trained his own boss. "The retention framework we use company-wide?" Robert added, warming to his subject. "That's Sarah's design. Increased our client retention by 37% and saved us millions in acquisition costs." Every word was another nail in the coffin of Marcus's assumptions. The methodologies he'd called outdated, the strategies he deemed inadequate, they were mine. The sophisticated techniques he thought I needed to learn, I had literally written the manual. "I had no idea you two had worked so closely together," Marcus managed, his voice barely audible. "Worked together?" Robert laughed again. "Marcus, Sarah didn't just work with me. She practically rebuilt our entire client portfolio strategy. We're still using her innovations today." The silence that followed was deafening. Marcus stared at his untouched salmon, like it held the secrets to salvaging his dignity. But there was no coming back from this. The power dynamic he'd spent 3 months constructing had just exploded in his face. "You're incredibly lucky to have her on your team," Robert said, checking his watch. "Make sure you're utilizing her expertise fully. The woman's a strategic genius." As Robert walked away, Marcus and I sat in the wreckage of his assumptions, the weight of his mistake settling over our table like a funeral shroud. The silence stretched between us like a chasm. Marcus stared at his plate, his earlier confidence not just gone, but seemingly erased from existence. The man who had confidently ordered my lunch without asking now looked incapable of forming complete sentences. He began, then stopped, swallowing hard. "I think I may have misunderstood your role here." "Misunderstood how exactly?" I asked, my voice calm but carrying enough edge to let him know this conversation was far from over. Marcus lifted his eyes to meet mine, and for the first time since he'd become my supervisor, I saw something resembling respect. "I made assumptions about your experience level based on..." He trailed off, realizing he was about to admit to judging me on factors that had nothing to do with my actual qualifications. "Based on what, Marcus?" The question forced him to confront the ugliness of his assumptions head-on. I watched him wrestle with the realization that his assessment had been built on organizational charts and his own prejudices, rather than actual performance data. I should have reviewed your accomplishments more thoroughly before drawing any conclusions about your capabilities," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "The client retention framework Robert mentioned," I said, leaning forward slightly. "The one you called outdated yesterday? I designed that during my 4th year here. It's been the foundation of our client services approach for 3 years. Each fact hit him like a physical blow. The sophisticated strategies he thought I needed to learn? Mine. The modern methodologies he'd condescended to teach me? I'd written them. The Morrison account that Robert referenced?" I continued. "They've specifically requested me for every major project since 2019. Their contract value has tripled under my management." Marcus absorbed each revelation like a man discovering he'd been living in a house built by the architect he'd been insulting. "Sarah, I owe you more than an apology. I owe you an explanation for why I made such fundamental errors in judgment." But I wasn't interested in his explanations. I was interested in something else entirely. "What I want to know, Marcus, is what you're going to do differently moving forward." The question hung in the air between us, and I could see him processing not just the immediate humiliation, but the broader implications for our working relationship and his own credibility as a leader. "I want to learn from you," he said finally, the words seeming to surprise him as much as they did me. "Not mentor you, learn from you. Your expertise, your strategies, your approach to client management. I clearly have more to learn than I realized." It wasn't just an apology. It was a complete surrender of the power dynamic he'd tried so hard to establish. And honestly, it was exactly what I'd been waiting to hear. 3 weeks later, everything had changed. The department that had been functioning under Marcus's micromanagement was now operating like the well-oiled machine it had been before his arrival. But this time, he was actually contributing instead of just commanding. "Sarah, could you review this client strategy before I present it to the Peterson Group?" Marcus asked, standing in my office doorway with a humility that would have been unimaginable a month ago. I looked up from my computer, still adjusting to this new version of my boss. The arrogant executive who had publicly questioned my competence had been replaced by someone who actually listened, who asked thoughtful questions, who had somehow learned to check his ego at the door. "Of course," I said, accepting the folder. "But Marcus, you know you don't need my approval for every client interaction, right?" He smiled. A real smile, not the condescending smirk I'd grown to hate. "I know, but your insights have improved every strategy I've implemented since that lunch." That lunch. Neither of us mentioned it directly anymore, but it hung in the air between us like a shared secret. The day Marcus Chen learned that assumptions could be career-ending mistakes. "The Morrison Group called this morning," he continued. "They want to expand their contract again. They specifically asked if you'd be leading the implementation." I nodded, unsurprised. "I'll handle the proposal this afternoon." "Actually," Marcus said, his tone shifting to something more serious, "I've been thinking about your role here. Your expertise is being underutilized in your current position." I looked up sharply. After months of being told I needed training, was he really suggesting what I thought he was suggesting? "I'm recommending you for promotion to senior strategic consultant," he said. "It comes with a significant salary increase and your own team to manage. Robert already approved it. Apparently he's been wondering why we hadn't promoted you years ago." The irony was perfect. The man who had spent 3 months trying to diminish my role was now advocating for my advancement. "There's one condition," Marcus added, and I tensed, waiting for the catch. "I want you to help me become a better leader. Not as your boss telling you what to do, but as a colleague asking for guidance." 6 months later, our department had the highest performance ratings in the company's history. Marcus had implemented framework after framework based on my recommendations, and together we'd created the kind of collaborative environment that actually got results. The best part? During the year-end review meeting, in the same conference room where this whole story began, Robert Kellerman stood up and announced that our department's innovations were being rolled out company-wide. "This success," Robert said, looking directly at me, "is the result of brilliant strategic thinking and exceptional leadership." Marcus caught my eye across the table and smiled. Not the old condescending smile, but something genuine and grateful. Sometimes the most powerful response to being underestimated isn't anger or confrontation. Sometimes it's simply allowing the truth to reveal itself. And when it does, The results speak louder than any argument ever could.